Hello and welcome to Take From It What You Will, the show where we review current events based on primary source information. I'm going to move away a little bit today from previous shows where we have gone over documents and given our objective analysis of those documents, what they mean or what they include. We try not to provide an opinion on this show, although at times it may come glowing through. Today, what I want to talk about, and I'm going to do it briefly, are some of the issues that have surfaced in the past few weeks, based on, of course, the attacks in Paris, after which we did a Take From It What You Will, and now with the terrorist activity here in the United States in San Bernardino, and perhaps a couple of other items that haven't really hit in the news as much, that are indicative of a dissatisfaction or a different direction that certain groups may want to go. Anyway, what we're going to discuss are a few of the items that are the topics of the day, and I want to try and give you some objective background into those topics. The first topic is going to be immigration, which is at the forefront of today's discussions by all of the political candidates, and unfortunately by some people in government who probably should not be making political or politicizing some of the statements that candidates are making, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. The history of immigration and immigration reform, immigration exclusivity, immigration acts, laws, regulations is the history of the United States. Since 1790, the U.S. has been, in one way or another, making attempts to control who comes to this country and how that person can go from an alien status or a resident status to citizenry. To a citizen status. And hardly a decade has gone by in the past 130 years that there hasn't been some type of reform in immigration. I think probably some of the more active periods were in the late 19th century with the Chinese exclusion. Then in the progressive eras, there were more attempts at exclusions of Japanese, exclusion of people based on their abilities, based on their threat to the government, their ability to not be a burden on the state, their technical skills, and these types of bans, exclusions, limits have gone right up through the 40s with World War II, of course, impacting 50s, 60s with Vietnam, impacting, and a lot of the focus of immigration law then was on the influx of Southeast Asians into the 80s when in the Reagan administration, when a lot of the reform dealt with Latin American immigrants who were mainly coming for economic reasons, for work, and right up into the current day when we're discussing the issue of refugees. Refugees have always had a special status when it comes to immigration and immigration law. Because of that, it came to be defined as people who cannot or are unwilling to return. I'm paraphrasing. Cannot or are unwilling to return to their place of residence because of a fear of persecution based on race, ethnicity, religion, political party, maybe a few other items, but those are the basics of it. And they have the preference to refugee status in the United States. On top of that, there have been quotas set by countries and for countries and regions, and essentially caps out, depending on what decade and years you're looking at. The caps have generally been in the range of 250 to 300,000 total immigrants permitted annually into the United States. And as I said, certain countries have had caps. There have always been caps in countries, always since the late 19th, early 20th century, and certain caps in certain regions, and then an overall cap. At times there have, when refugee crises have been in the forefront, World War II, Southeast Asia, for example, there has been a preference for refugees, allowing refugees to come to the U.S. So that's always been at the base of immigration. Now, getting to this refugee problem, the problem with Islamics coming from Syria and the Middle Eastern, Southwest Asia region into the Western world, into Europe, and then into the United States. And again, the quotas are coming up as to how many each country will take. Again, and remember that the U.S. is capped for total immigration at between 250 and 300,000. It varies from year to year per annum. And the issue of there being embeds, of there being terrorists in there. To me, yes, of course that's a fear. And of course you have to do the best job you can of vetting. But this argument of, all right, can you 100% guarantee? Well, of course it'll never be 100% guarantee, so you can never do this. But we have to approach this sanely and according to our laws. Our laws are set and are there to be obeyed. So yes, you have to go through the legal vetting process. Yes, there's a preference for refugees to come to our country. A quota does need to be set. This can be set by the executive. Of course, Congress has the right to come in and set that as well, or on their own set that quota and then come between the executive and Congress. Come to an agreement on what that quota will be on an annual basis, because quotas have always been set. But the idea of not accepting a group based on religion is essentially new. There have been restrictions internally in the U.S. for aliens, immigrants, permanent residents that have generally been rapidly quashed against certain religions at different times. But generally those have not lasted very long. It's really not worth bringing up here unless you, except for historical reasons. If you're a historical interest of, I could cover a bunch of those. But this concept of Muslims not being allowed into the U.S. is there's no legal basis for it, so it can't really be done. Now, there's been a call to ban the Muslims, and then likening that to what was done with the Japanese, the internment camps, the Japanese in World War II. It's been done at other times, actually, by the U.S. But this cannot be done on a religious basis. That was not on a religious basis. That was on the basis of their ethnicity, which should not be allowed, of course. but it was because of the ethnicity. The Japanese were from Japan. They didn't base it on the ethnicity specifically, but well, I won't go into that. You could argue either way on that, depending on how you look at that. But there is no basis for using a religious test to ban someone from emigrating to the U.S., especially when you're looking at refugee status. So the thing to do is set the quota, do the vetting process as good as you can. But once refugees come to the country, I mean, the thing everyone needs to realize is the refugees are not set free. You're in any refugee program. You're not just turned loose. Of course, if there's a community, a family, or so on, the government does not then have to support them perhaps as much, and they're put with the family. But there's still a reporting requirement. You have to register. You have to know where these people are at. And the big thing will be the follow-up on that. The concern will be is if, in my mind, if refugees at any point, any time, feel like they're being excluded, or are being singled out for special treatment, negative treatment, that's when you run the risk, I think, of radicalizing people. But the last thing you want to do is to bring us refugees into the country and have them not assimilate. All prior refugee programs have been overtly based exactly on that. Overtly based. And by overtly, I mean it's stated so either right in the law itself or during the discussion either in Congress or by the executive when they announced either through executive action or through congressional act the establishment of these refugees quotas and programs. It has always overtly been stated that there needs to be assimilation. And so I think the follow-up needs to be more by our politicians these days. What is the assimilation program going to look like? What are we going to do to assimilate these people? And I think a happily assimilated group that are given economic opportunities, educational opportunities, the opportunity to assimilate. Plenty of Muslims in the U.S. We're not talking about renouncing religiously, but there has to be an assimilation into the American life. English, of course, people need to learn English, that kind of thing. We do need to get back to that. But so anyway, I think yes, legally, refugees have preferred status. This is what we're saying. Always have had. Refugees need to assimilate, and need to be vetted, but also need follow-up. They need to be able to report in and need to be tracked. These are the important things that need to be done, and those processes that will follow on the arrival of the refugees are what I think our politicians need to focus on more than this concept of, he says 10,000 now and it's 100,000 next year and then it's 1 million, and they're ridiculous the kind of things to be talking about. We need to, roll up our sleeves, do the work legally, according to our law, is how things are done in this country. And then do the follow-up, do the hard task, follow this up with the assimilation programs and the follow-up on the assimilation. So it's going to take some work, yes, it's going to take some time. The second topic I want to cover is related to that, and the fear that is becoming so pervasive in the country and around the world, is the issue of terrorism. And terror is just that. It's the word terror. It drives fear, unreasonable fear. a mind-numbing fear. That's what terror is, into people's consciousness, where you don't know how to react. I mean, we seem to be getting back to the days of the late 50s or mid to late 50s with the civil patrols and the nuclear bomb shelters, and what do you do in case of a nuclear attack. And then what we all learned, at least I was learned when I grew up as a kid, just in the early elementary years. Later on, they let it go. But I think I think there is an issue, though, where that terror is embedded already in the U.S. and around the Western world. There are groups. This is going to happen again. What's happened in Paris? What's happened in San Bernardino? This is going to happen again. These are issues that we need to address. How do we address them? I think what we're seeing, and I think one of the reasons that people like Donald Trump and some of the what would be considered relatively radical ideas, banning the Muslims, building the walls, etc., registering all Muslims, I think there's the reason that that popularity is so misunderstood or confusing even to a lot of the mainstream media and to the administration, not just the executive, but to most of the politicians, are that there is a swelling sentiment, fear, terror amongst the Western population that this threat is not being taken seriously. I'm not saying seriously enough, not being taken seriously. I mean that as an absolute. I think what you see in President Obama, what you see in Josh Earnest, what you see in most of the media outlets, CNN certainly, even Fox News, I think what you're seeing is this. And it's something in this. I'm not trying to hide this. It's something that is baffling them. Is this little bit of a disconnect in that they don't understand that the fear amongst the general population is like the fear that was shared by the government and the population back during World War II days. What happens if we lose? And I don't think that's even being. I don't even think that crosses President Obama's mind, and I don't think it crosses anyone's mind in the media, and I don't think anyone in Congress, whether Republican or Democrat. What happens if we lose? That's what people are fearing. What we need are politicians to, and that may seem, this may just seem ridiculous. How could we lose to a bunch of people who don't have an air force? Well, you know what? This is a groundswell, and things can snowball really, really fast. And by losing, I don't mean necessarily, although it's a possibility, that the United States is overrun by Muslims, but it certainly could reach the point where the Middle East becomes radicalized. Where parts of Eastern Europe become radicalized, Northern Africa becomes radicalized. I think it's just waiting for the day for the fall of the Saudi Empire, for that to really start taking hold, and a big war between the Shia and Sunnis. That, in essence, would be a loss for the Western world, and would establish this sort of Cold War similar to what was going on with the USSR and the West a couple of decades ago. And I think what we need to do is take a page out of the book of people like Winston Churchill And we need the kind of rhetoric, and the rhetoric is somewhat what I'm talking about is rhetoric. We need our politicians, we need our executive, we need a leader to be a leader. Come out and say that. And of course, now recently he said, but he's been very petulant, and he doesn't show the emotion you want. I think he's frustrated. This isn't the issue he wanted to tackle, certainly not in his last year in office. So I think we're in risky times right now, and I think should the worm turn, should things flip, and our current executive have to go very strongly into a militant posture, that you're going to see something extremely militant, and I think it'd be something none of us would like. So what we need to do, I think, is something a little stronger right now, and it needs to be a non-unilateral, hopefully, action, and we need to establish the militarily in the Middle East to prevent this. And this is going to be along the lines of this is what I see. What has been successful? Post-World War II, the establishment between Eastern and Western Europe of NATO and mainly U.S. forces that were there as a cork in a bottle. After the end of the war and some pushes here, some pushes there, things kind of leveled out, and it was just that, a corked bottle. North-South Korea, same thing. When did we fail to do this kind of thing? Vietnam, when we tried to go in, instead of have the DMZ put a force in, and granted, stay there for ad nauseum, like we have in Korea, like we still have in Europe, and had more so in East and West Germany after World War II. You have a cork in a bottle, and if the U.S. and the Western world are going to remain the dominant power, that is what is going to be required in the Middle East. That kind of a philosophy. We need a philosophy of probably established in Iran, or in Iraq, excuse me, not Iran, in Iraq, perhaps with Turkey, Jordan. We need to have adequate forces that will be combined, probably majority U.S., similar as we have in Korea, similar as we have in Europe, forces that are there keeping the peace. And this is going to go on for decades. But that's the successful strategy we've used before. There's not a lot of fighting. Once things, you don't see a lot of casualties coming out of Koreas. We don't see it coming out of Europe these days. That's what needs to be established. Yes, initially there's going to be fighting. Absolutely, just like there was in Korea. Just, of course, like there was just after the end of World War II. There was fighting between people push and shove. But it's going to get established that this is what's going to hold that region together, and you have that force there. I mean, look at it. It's not going to be, after the initial phases are done, a few years, it's not going to be super hazardous duty. It'll be like deploying to Korea, like deploying to Europe. You'll be deploying to the Middle East, and it's going to give hundreds of thousands of jobs. That's what it's going to be, both in the U.S. and they're posted overseas. You have a 2-year stint, whatever the military is for most of them, some of them longer. But that is the strategy that's going to work in the Middle East, and that's the only thing we have to go for. That's what we have to do. It should be a combined effort, again, not just the U.S., Western Europe, and a lot, just like in Korea, the South Koreans, a lot of the local army. The other thing that could be done, and started immediately, that I should have mentioned back with the refugees, is there was a mention by one of the news or more of the media about a lot, the refugees fleeing Syria are predominantly young males. Well, that seemed to be that there was an implication there that this meant that they were in bed. So I don't believe so. I think young males are always the ones who want to get the hell out when they can, when there's a problem. because you have, perhaps no family strings attached. You just don't get out. You're not married. You don't have kids. You go, you get out. Why not have a combined force when these people are coming through, either in Turkey or beyond, but preferably the Syrian-Turkey border? Deal with Turkey, have U.S. and coalition forces there, that as they're checking through, offer the opportunity for these young military age type young men to go into a local military coalition force and set them off, have established camps, train them to be the military that we're going to require there. I think they might go for it. You offer them a good wage. There are coalition forces there training them, not just their Syrian army people. You have a true coalition force, and you take those millions, and if there's 500,000 young men, and you get 300,000, or you get 100,000 even, there you have a force, and you start training them now. And those are the guys who are going to be the meat of that group that I'm talking about, that are going to have to be in there, the cork in the bottle kind of thing. So anyway, I've gone on way longer than I had hoped to on this. I wanted to keep it down to about 20 minutes. I see I'm approaching the 30-minute line, so I'll try and top it off at 30. The last thing I want to cover is something that's just been I don't want to say it's bothering me, but it gets it's in my head a little bit when I watch the news, and I try not to watch the news more than a few minutes a day. I try and get my news, as far as the mainstream media, CNN, and I'll watch I'll turn on CNN, Fox, Business, Bloomberg, and watch some initial stories to see, is there something going on of import. And then when it starts getting into the Chris Cuomos and the Jake Tappers and the Brett Baers and the Joe Scarboroughs making their commentary, I usually switch off unless they have somebody there who's a guest I'm interested in talking and listening to what they're talking about. I'll usually switch off. I'll go, quite frankly, I get most of my news now out of BBC and AJAM. It's the Al Jazeera America, which tends to have more international news. Both of them tend to have more international news. And when I can get it, CNN and Espanol, I'm fluent in Spanish, so that tends to be less biased or less politicized than the local CNN. But anyway, the last thing I want to cover, I got 2 minutes here. The election's coming up. I mean, everything's nuts between the Republicans and the Democrats, and the conspiracy theory is Donald Trump trying to hand the election to Hillary Clinton. And what's going on with Hillary Clinton? Nobody's talking about the emails anymore, even though now they've come up with all the emails that show she knew what was going on in Benghazi, and then there was the offer by drawing a blank now, that there could have been a military response to that within 4 hours instead of the 11 hours, and perhaps have prevented some of the deaths that went on there that would have disrupted the thing. The whole attack in Benghazi. This is getting no play at all. I think people were just, the hand was played way too early, so now people are tired of it and they're not going to listen. It doesn't matter what comes up, nobody's going to listen to it. But the fact that almost on a daily basis you hear Josh Earnest commenting on what the politicians are saying that are in the race, to me, it just rubs me raw. I just thought, what in the world is Josh Earnest, who is speaking for the president, for the executive office, what in the world are they doing making comments on what any politician is saying? And if he's going to comment on what Donald Trump is saying and what Ted Cruz is saying and what whoever is saying, why isn't he commenting on what Bernie Sanders is saying? Why isn't he commenting on what Hillary Clinton is saying? I'm sorry. for an executive who has no chance of staying in office to focus at a time like this on petty things like this, and to make these kind of petty comments, to me is just something that is below that office. I'm sorry. I just disagree completely with it. So anyway, that was a bit of my personal opinion. I'm sorry. I try not to put those in there, but when things get out of what I feel are outside where the dignity of the office should place it, then I will make a comment. And I'll probably be more opinionated as time goes by. Anyway, I appreciate you. I hope you take your time to listen to this. And that's what I have for today. Take from it what you will.